I hadn't seen Mark in years. Not since we were kids running through the woods behind our neighborhood, making up stories and getting lost in our own world. Back then, he was the kind of friend you could count on for anything. A carefree spirit, always smiling, always pulling me into some wild adventure. We drifted apart after high school, as people do, life pulling us in different directions. So, when he reached out a few weeks ago, saying we should catch up, I felt a strange mix of excitement and nostalgia. But when we finally met, something was off. Mark wasn't the same. The easy laughter, the warmth that used to radiate from him, it was gone. His eyes were darker, hollowed, like he hadn't slept in days. His movements were twitchy, his voice quiet, almost paranoid, like he was constantly checking over his shoulder. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking maybe it was just stress or work getting to him. But the more time I spent with him, the more I realized it was something deeper. He wasn't just tired, he was scared. And whatever was bothering him, he wasn't talking about it. The worst part was, it didn't feel like the Mark I remembered was even there anymore. It was like he'd been replaced by someone who looked like him, but didn't feel like him at all. It wasn't until our third time meeting up that Mark finally opened up about what was going on. We were sitting in his apartment, the place dimly lit, curtains drawn even though it was still daytime. He hadn't been saying much, just fidgeting with his hands, staring at nothing. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Do you remember the game?" At first, I didn't know what he was talking about. We used to play all kinds of games as kids, most of them just stupid dares or make-believe. But when he said it again, more insistent this time, something clicked in my mind. A memory I hadn't thought about in years resurfaced. This old game we used to play, back when we were maybe 10 or 11. We'd heard about it from some older kids, this weird, creepy ritual that was supposed to summon a presence. We didn't know what it was supposed to be, and honestly, we didn't care. It was just a way to freak each other out. We'd draw these symbols on the ground, chant some nonsense, and pretend like we'd actually felt something. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Yeah, I remember. We were idiots. But Mark didn't laugh. His face was serious, more intense than I'd ever seen it. "It wasn't just a game," he said quietly. "You don't understand. We called it. It's real." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. He was looking at me with this desperate intensity, like he was begging me to believe him. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was being ridiculous, but there was something in his voice, something so terrified and convinced, that made my stomach twist. He went on to explain that, after we stopped hanging out, he kept thinking about the game. He couldn't get it out of his head. A few months ago, he tried playing it again by himself. That's when it started. At first, little things like feeling watched, hearing whispers at night. But now, he was sure the entity we'd summoned as kids was real. And it was following him. I sat there, staring at him, unsure whether to feel sorry for him or scared for myself. This was crazy. There was no way any of this could be true. But as he kept talking, that sinking feeling in my gut grew. Because what if he wasn't wrong? First, I tried to shake off what Mark told me. I mean, how could any of it be real? We were just kids back then, messing around. But the more I hung out with him, the harder it became to ignore the strange things happening around him. It started small, barely noticeable. I'd be sitting in his apartment, and out of nowhere, I'd feel a sudden cold draft, like someone had left a window open. Except the windows were always shut tight. I didn't say anything the first few times, but I could see it in Mark's eyes. He felt it too. Then it escalated. We'd be sitting in silence when something would shift across the room. A book sliding a few inches across the table, a chair creaking like someone had just sat in it. Mark would barely react anymore, like he'd gotten used to it, but I hadn't. My heart would start racing, my mind scrambling to come up with logical explanations. But every time, it left me more unsettled. It wasn't just the movement of things, it was the feeling that came with it. The room felt heavy, like the air itself was thicker, pressing down on me. One night, when we were sitting in his living room, Mark suddenly whispered, "It's getting stronger." He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a wildness in them that made my skin crawl. It wants me, and it's coming closer. I tried to reason with him, tell him that it was all in his head, but deep down I was starting to doubt myself. There was something in that apartment, something I couldn't explain. And it wasn't just the cold drafts or the moving objects. It was the feeling, this constant, oppressive sensation of being watched. Like there was always something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I started to feel it even when I wasn't with him. At home, late at night, I'd catch myself checking the corners of my room, expecting to see something there, just out of the corner of my eye. I'd hear faint whispers, so soft that I couldn't make out what they were saying, but loud enough to make my heart race. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. I really did, but it was getting harder and harder to convince myself that this wasn't real. Because whatever it wasn't just after Mark anymore. It was after both of us. Mark's decline was fast, frighteningly fast. Every time I saw him, he looked worse. His face was pale, sunken, and the dark circles under his eyes had deepened to bruises. He wasn't sleeping anymore. At first, he admitted to getting a couple of hours here and there, but soon even that stopped. He said every time he closed his eyes, he'd hear it, the entity, whispering to him, calling his name, telling him things I can't even repeat. I tried to get him to go to a doctor, anyone who could help. You just need rest, Mark, I'd say. This isn't real. You're exhausted. Your mind's playing tricks on you. But the moment I'd mention sleep or seeing someone, his face would twist with panic. He'd shake his head violently and grab my arm, his grip hard and desperate. No, he'd whisper, eyes darting around the room like he expected something to crawl out of the shadows. You don't get it. I can't sleep. That's when it comes. That's when it's closest. I can hear it right beside me, waiting. I tried everything I could think of. I stayed with him some nights, just to show him he wasn't alone, that nothing was going to happen. But it didn't matter. It only made him worse. He'd sit there, staring into the corners of the room, flinching at every little sound, like something was creeping up on him. The way he acted, the way he looked, it was like he was a prisoner in his own skin, constantly on edge, constantly terrified. There were moments when he'd snap, his voice frantic. It's stronger now. I can feel it getting closer. It wants me, and I'm running out of time. He said it over and over like a mantra. His fear was so real, so raw, that it was impossible to ignore. I started to believe him. Or at least, I couldn't dismiss him anymore. I offered to help in any way I could. Take him somewhere far away, stay with him for as long as he needed. But every suggestion made him more anxious. He didn't want to leave his apartment. He said it wouldn't matter where he went, it would follow. You can't outrun something like this, he told me, his voice a broken whisper. It's not just in this place. It's in me now. It was like watching someone lose their mind right in front of me, and I felt powerless. No matter what I said, no matter how much I tried to reason with him, the fear consumed him. And the worst part was, some part of me was starting to feel it too. That same sense of dread. The feeling that maybe we were both running out of time. I hadn't heard from Mark in days. He stopped answering my calls, my texts, nothing. After everything he told me, after watching him spiral deeper and deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. So I decided to go to his apartment. I told myself it was just to check on him, to make sure he was okay. But deep down, I already knew what I'd find. When I arrived, the building was eerily quiet. Mark's door was slightly ajar, which sent a shiver down my spine. I pushed it open and stepped inside, calling his name. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. The air was heavy, suffocating, thick with an unnatural cold that sank into my bones. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The apartment was a wreck. Furniture overturned, books scattered across the floor, as if there had been some kind of struggle. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved through the chaos, calling out for Mark. There was no answer. I made my way to his bedroom, and that's when I saw it. On the walls, scrawled in a frantic hand, were cryptic messages. It's here. I can't escape. It's coming for me. The writing was erratic, smeared, like it had been done in a hurry, maybe even in terror. And then I saw the last message, written in thick, bold strokes above his bed. I'm sorry. Mark was gone. But the room, it felt alive. The shadows seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy, like they were watching me, waiting. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to run and never look back, but something kept me frozen in place. It was the same feeling I'd had in those final days with Mark, that oppressive, suffocating sensation of being watched. I stood there, staring into the dark corners of the room, and that's when I felt it, the cold. It wasn't just the chill in the air. It was something else, something unnatural. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I could hear it. The whisper. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but it grew louder, closer, until it was right there, right behind me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows. I knew that something was there watching, waiting, and just for a moment, I felt it, the presence. Cold, suffocating, pressing against my skin, like it was testing me, deciding whether to take me too. That's when I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of that apartment, but I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart pounding like it was going to explode. Mark was gone, and whatever had taken him, whatever he had summoned, it wasn't done, because now I could still feel it, following me, just like it had followed him.